for that. There goes half my speech. As you know, vets, we love to talk about ourselves, and we also use a lot of the acronyms and the big words. They don't really mean that much. We just like to hear other people try to pronounce them a lot of times, don't we? But no, good morning, students, administration, faculty, staff, and to my fellow veterans in attendance. Hoo-yah, hoorah, hoo-ah, and hoo-ah. Good to see you guys here this morning. Thank you so much. As she said, my name is Gabe Martin. I'm currently a pastor, but before that, I did serve 11 years active duty as a United States Naval Air Crewman. I haven't been in this building since I was a student here, and honestly, I never really thought I'd get invited back. But no, thank you very much for having me. It's been many years since I've been here, but this has been a wonderful program, and I'm honored to be a part of it. Many of you students may not be aware of what Veterans Day really is about or the history of it. I know I wasn't for much of my life. World War I, in which America was heavily involved, was formally ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. That's when the warring countries signed what's known as the armistice, and the anniversary became known as Armistice Day, and it was used as a day to celebrate the heroism of those who had fought for America in World War I, the war that was supposed to end all wars. Sadly, that didn't happen. We've seen many wars since then. In 1954, President Eisenhower had Armistice Day renamed Veterans Day. And since then, Veterans Day has been a national holiday set aside to honor all who have served and are serving in the United States Armed Forces. Now, many of you here, if you're a student, you've never known what it's like to be alive when your country wasn't at war. I remember when our country entered the Persian Gulf War. I was a 5th grade student in Miss McInnes's 5th grade class. And I remember her telling us about it and what a big deal it was that our country was at war, and we had to learn this. And we learned what it meant for men and women to go over and fight for our freedom. And I remember we got to write letters to deployed soldiers and sailors. And some of us, we got letters back. And I remember that was a huge deal to think, wow, these men and women are over defending me. These men and women have left their home and their families. And even at 5th grade, because war was so new, it wasn't something that I had just always known in my life. And I remember there was a big celebration whenever the war ended. If you're a student here, you were born while our country was at war, and we have been since then. And by no fault of your own, your generation has just come to expect war. And in the same way, your generation, I'm not talking to particular people in here, but there is a generation that is becoming more and more just expectant of war and for others to go and fight that war and to defend us. And so I believe it's important then for your generation to be reminded that war is not the norm. War should not be accepted as the norm. And you should be reminded that war, it's not just one of those things that goes on and doesn't concern me. Whether or not you're fighting in the war, whether or not you're serving the war effort in the armed forces or not, when your country's at war, it does concern you. Because even if you're not involved in it, someone you know is or has been involved in that. And the worst thing we can do as a country is to raise a generation that does not appreciate the service of men and women who are willing to sacrifice everything for the liberty that we enjoy in this country. I heard a woman recently really giving a vet a hard time about asking for a veteran's discount. And she really just let this guy have it of why he thought just because he was a veteran he was so privileged. Now, I love his response. He said, ma'am, I'm asking for a discount, not a privilege. A privilege is getting to go home to your family every night. To go home in a free country, that's a privilege. And that's what many people in a younger generation are failing to recognize. The privilege that's been provided to us by men and women who've made that sacrifice. This is why Veterans Day events like this are important. They remind us of why we honor our vets. So to illustrate that quickly, I would like to tell you a story. It's a remarkable story of military service, and it doesn't involve war, but it actually involves peace. In 2008, I was deployed to the South Pacific on board the USNS Mercy. It was a hospital ship, and we were on board as the helicopter detachment We were taking humanitarian aid to underdeveloped countries all throughout the Southern Pacific. And we had seen a lot of amazing things happen. The doctors would perform surgeries. They would administer medicines. We had dentists that would perform surgeries and tooth extractions. And these people could not ever have imagined receiving services like this. But here, America and our armed forces were taking it to them. On August 8th, we received a call. We were just off the coast of Papua New Guinea. And the Australian Embassy in Papua New Guinea contacted us about one of their citizens who had become ill while hiking in the mountains of Papua New Guinea. Her fellow hikers had contacted the embassy by satellite phone and said that she was near death and they had no way to get her out. The weather conditions were absolutely terrible, especially for flying a helicopter. And so the Australian military had decided they couldn't launch their helicopters in this weather. So they called and asked if we thought we could get to the hiker. We did a quick meeting, a quick map study. We considered all the risks, and we decided that we would attempt the rescue. The flight crew had been assigned the night before, consisted of 2 pilots and 2 air crewmen, of which I was one. We brought on board 1 medical corpsman to go with us to help assist in anything that might pop up. After doing a map study of the area, we determined that the only way to safely fly through this with the cloud cover was to ascend higher than any known obstacle. So we had to climb to 10,000 feet. In a helicopter, that's pretty high. And we had to fly right through the clouds towards a GPS point. And I know we hear GPS on our phones, and they're amazing, and they take us right where we need to be all the time, every time. But when you're flying through some mountains, a GPS point is not always a lot to go off of. But we made it to the point. We found some holes in the clouds and were able to work our way down. When we saw the terrain, we saw the mountains, we were able to start skirting along the mountains. We had the clouds just above us, mountains just below us. Had no idea what we were looking for. When we came around a bend in the mountain range, we saw 4 small fires that were arranged in the formation of a cross. And you don't see that too often in the mountains, so we figured maybe that was for us. So we did a quick survey at the landing site. We went in, we landed. When we got there, we found out that she was actually close to 3/4 of a mile further up the mountain. So I grabbed my gear, I grabbed the corpsman, and we headed up. When we got to her, we determined she was okay to move, even though she was unconscious and in bad shape. And the villagers actually helped move her down the mountain on a bamboo stretcher. We got her back in the helicopter. We started an IV back up to 10,000 feet, back to the hospital ship. The doctors determined she had developed hyponatremia, and this is a condition that results when you sweat all the sodium out of your body. And they determined had we been 2 hours later, she would have died. This is the reason I joined the Navy. In 2005, when I enlisted, I signed up for rescue swimmer school. I wanted to go, I wanted to save people. And here, I'm getting, now as a rescue swimmer, you don't think that you're going to be climbing the mountains and mud, but hey, that's part of the job, I guess. And the Navy prepared me for that. But this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to rescue people. And this is a pretty cool story to tell people. This is the story the ship heard that night. It's the story that was printed in magazines. This story was printed in Australian newspapers. The flight crew got to meet the Australian ambassador, the American ambassador, because of this remarkable story. The flight crew was brought in front of the entire ship that evening, and we were presented medals on the spot for the life-saving efforts. But I told you I was going to tell you a remarkable story. Nothing I have said so far is remarkable. All you've heard so far is about sailors doing their job. The rest of the story is what's truly remarkable. What most people won't realize is all that had to take place for that mission to be successful. Most people won't hear the sacrifice that's in that story. When the decision was made to go, in a flash, 32 people set about working. Our detachment that maintained the helicopters and worked on the helicopters consisted of 32 men and women who were there on deployment with us. Because of the weather, the helicopter had been folded and stored inside the hangar. And an 8-man move crew had to get together, move it out of the hangar, unfold it, get it ready for flight. Just that process alone had required hours and hours of training. Other maintenance personnel checked the fuel and inspection logs to determine the tasks that needed to be done to enable the helicopter to complete the mission. These inspections and reports had been completed by trained personnel for months and months prior to the rescue. Other people had to prep the gear and ready the cabin. In reality, the only reason that helicopter was able to fly because of the months and months of hard work that men and women had put in to make sure that it maintained its ready status. Most of these people received no reward, no award, and no recognition. They were just doing their job. Yet the mission would not be successful without every single one of these men and women working together. And so maybe what you heard is, again, that's more people just doing their jobs. But what a veteran will hear is all the sacrifice that's involved. The preparation for that one mission required thousands of man-hours of training, of preparation. Every person involved was willing to sacrifice years away from moms and dads, to sacrifice months away from wives, husbands, sons, and daughters. My wife was pregnant with our first child at the time. I missed most of the pregnancy. The following year, when I deployed again, my son was just 4 months old. I missed most of the first year of his life. My fellow crewman on that flight, the other guy that was with me, he had a 3-month-old son that he had never met. His son was born 2 weeks after we deployed. This is what veterans will hear in this story. Not just men and women doing their job, but they'll hear dads willing to miss the births of their children, moms willing to miss holidays, couples missing milestones and anniversaries, people sacrificing what others take for granted. And they're willing to do that so that you and I can be here this morning. Most of the sacrifices are not the ones you hear about. We live in a day where we honor those sacrifices that make the headlines. We honor those stories that get turned into a movie. We honor those stories that get turned into a book deal. But just because you've never heard of some of the names of the men and women here today, don't think that their sacrifice is any less real. Because of their sacrifice, you're able to be here. I'm able to be here. Because of their sacrifice, I'm able to preach the Word of God freely in public. I'm able to pastor a church. Because of these men and women's sacrifice, you're able to go to school. You're able to learn. You're able to attend church. You're able to go home to your families. These men and women made that happen. And that is what this flag represents. Some people look at this flag and they'll protest it because of all the ways in which our country fails. No one's saying here today that our country is perfect, but this flag doesn't represent perfection. This flag represents the country that we aspire to be. This flag represents you and I. It represents the sacrifice of all these men and women who stood between us and our enemies. And because of what it represents, our veterans were willing to defend it. Many of us, many of you maybe own cell phones, and we just take that for granted. Many of you own a cell phone maybe you didn't pay for. Maybe you drive a car that you didn't buy. That's, you're teenagers, that's expected. But our society is becoming more and more accustomed to having others providing for us and showing little appreciation for it. This is, for the first time in my life, starting to be applied with how many people are treating veterans. Because we're seeing a generation that doesn't know the value of our veterans. And they're starting to take them for granted. The vast majority of veterans' sacrifices are made very quietly and with little recognition. Most of these sacrifices weren't rewarded with medals, newspaper articles. Still, you and I sleep and rise under the freedom that they've provided, because of their hard work, their commitment, their dedication, and most of all, their sacrifice. And that's why today is about them. And it's not about the wrenches they turned. It's not about the trucks they drive. It's not about the bases they patrolled. It's not about them jumping out of planes or standing guard. Let me make this clear. Veterans Day is not a pat on the back for a job they've done. It's thankfulness, honor, and appreciation for the sacrifices that they've made. And so, I'll close with this. Our society, our country is filled with brave men and women who, again, listen to that word sacrifice, who have sacrificed for you and I. Don't be the generation that expects the sacrifice of others. Be the generation that honors the sacrifice of others. Thank you.